Chapter 1. The Lipstick Mark on the Bible Lit was one of those fog-bound mornings in London where the very air seemed laced with secrets. The smoke from the chimney-pots clung low to the rooftops like guilty thoughts, and even the bells of St. Dunstan's sounded muffled, as though hesitant to draw attention. I had just returned from an early constitutional along the Embankment when I found Holmes already awake and standing, uncharacteristically, by the window of our Baker Street sitting-room. He had not touched his tea, nor lit his pipe, but stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon a hansom cab that had just halted before our door. "You observe, Watson," he murmured, without turning, "that we are to be engaged today by a person of considerable distress. You'll note the tremor in the driver's left hand as he accepts his fare, an indication of either great nerves or the proximity of some unwholesome drama." A moment later, a knock came at the door, brisk but faltering at the end as if it had been meant to sound firm. But the hand had failed the will. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a tall, angular woman, perhaps in her early 50s, dressed in morning attire, her face pale but composed. Her gloved hands gripped a small leather-bound Bible. "I beg your pardon for calling so early," she said, in a voice that trembled beneath its propriety. "I am Miss Agatha March. I was told you might be the only man in London who could make sense of something so confounding." Holmes gestured courteously to the armchair nearest the fire. "Pray, make yourself comfortable. You may speak with perfect freedom here." Miss March hesitated before taking her seat. "It concerns my sister," she said. "She was found dead 3 days ago in the vestry of St. Michael's Church in Hampstead. The police have concluded it was natural causes, a heart attack brought on by age and perhaps sorrow. But they're wrong. I know it in my bones." She drew in a breath, then opened the Bible she carried and turned it around for us to see. There, against the inside of the front cover, stark upon the cream-colored end paper, was the vivid impression of a lipstick mark, a perfect pair of lips carmine red, unmistakably recent. "It wasn't there when the police returned her things to me," she whispered. "I opened the Bible again last night and found this." Holmes leaned forward with sudden interest, examining the page without touching it. "You are quite sure this is your sister's Bible?" he asked. "It has not passed through any other hands." "I am the only living family she had," Miss March replied, "and I remember clearly this was the Bible she carried with her always. There was no lipstick. There never would have been." Watson, still half skeptical, asked, "Your sister, was she a particularly religious woman?" "Devout," Miss March said. "More than that. She was the church's sacristan. She tended to the altar linens, prepared the communion vessels, and locked the chapel after the final services. She was incapable of vanity. Lipstick, Dr. Watson, would have been utterly foreign to her." Holmes looked up sharply. "Then we must ask who placed it there, and when." She nodded slowly. "Precisely. It's not just the strangeness of it. It's the fact that it implies someone had access to her Bible after her death, someone who returned it to her belongings, unseen." I felt a faint chill. The notion was undeniably unsettling. Holmes, however, seemed animated by the very irregularity. "Tell me everything you can, every detail, however seemingly trivial," Miss March obliged. Recounting the events of 3 days ago, her sister Ruth March had been found by the vicar. Reverend Layton slumped against the sacristy wall, her keys still in her hand, the vestry door locked from the inside. The church, an old flintstone building standing on a rise just north of the heath, had not seen any forced entry. No valuables were missing, and no marks of violence were discovered. The medical examiner had concluded natural death, and the local constable had accepted that verdict readily. But now, Holmes mused, eyes half-lidded. You believe someone tampered with her things after her passing, someone who returned this Bible with its ... curious imprint? Yes, she said. And what's more, I cannot think who could have done it or why. Holmes tapped his fingers together. Did your sister have enemies? Lovers? Miss March flushed. She was a solitary soul, Mr. Holmes. There was one man, many years ago, but that ended poorly. He left for the continent and never returned. Beyond that, she devoted herself entirely to the church. Holmes turned the Bible gently in his hands, examining the spine, the gilding on the page edges. And the clergy at St. Michael's, Reverend Layton, you said? A good man, she replied quickly. Young for the post, but earnest. Ruth admired him, I think. And there is Miss Sarah Vellum, the organist, and Mr. Bancroft, the churchwarden. They were the only others with keys to the vestry. Holmes' expression shifted as if a thought had begun to settle. He nodded. Then I believe Dr. Watson and I should pay a visit to Hampstead. Miss March, there is something deeply unnatural about a Bible bearing the trace of a kiss, especially when held by one who had no living lips to place it. Her hands tightened around her gloves. Then you do believe me? I believe, said Holmes softly, that the dead do not return their books with new messages. Miss March left soon after, her eyes brighter, though still haunted, as the cab pulled away and the mist swallowed it whole. I turned to Holmes. You're truly taking this case. Indeed, Watson. There is an artifice at work, one that required access, forethought, and a particular sense of theatricality. Whoever did this wished for the gesture to be seen, but only after it was too late to question it. You think it's murder? I think, Holmes said, reaching for his pipe at last, that no one applies lipstick to the sacred unless they mean to make a point. The question is, what message lies behind the mark? And with that, the game had begun. Chapter 2. An early morning in Hampstead. The morning air in Hampstead was sharper than in Baker Street, carrying the scent of wet leaves and damp stone from the surrounding churchyard. The cab jolted to a stop outside St. Michael's, a modest flint and sandstone church, its steeple partially shrouded in a drifting veil of mist. Holmes alighted first, his keen gaze sweeping over the facade and its worn stained-glass windows. I followed, buttoning my coat against the wind, still pondering the strange image of a red lipstick mark upon a sacred text. The very notion lingered in my mind like an echophant but troubling. Miss March awaited us at the gate, her black coat and veil casting her in funereal silhouette against the iron railings. She offered no greeting beyond a nod, leading us across the gravel path toward the vestry side door. Holmes paused, his eyes drawn to the heavy hinges and the age-warped frame. You say it was locked from within? He asked, running a finger along the door's edge. Yes, she answered. They had to remove a small stained-glass panel to reach the bolt from outside. Reverend Layton did it himself. He found her after she failed to meet him for the midday bell. Inside, the church was quiet, its nave dim and lined with pews that seemed to lean toward the altar as if drawn by faith or sorrow. Holmes moved slowly through the space, eyes half shut. His footsteps echoed faintly on the worn flagstones as he passed beneath the brass chandeliers and the faded banners of parish history. A modest parish, he murmured, unremarkable in every details, save, perhaps, its silence. The vestry was small, lined with oak cupboards and a single table. It was here that Ruth March had been found. Holmes stood in the center, glancing toward the spot Miss March indicated by the wall near a worn crimson hassock. She was seated there, Miss March said softly, still upright, as if she had fallen asleep. Holmes crouched, brushing his hand along the baseboard, and held his fingers up to the light. Dust, disturbed recently, not by cleaning, and yet the rest of the room is untouched. He rose and turned toward a modest coat rack. Where was her handbag kept? Here, Miss March replied. The police returned it, along with her Bible. Holmes nodded, noting the height and placement. Then he moved to the table, upon which rested a pewter candlestick, a stack of hymnals, and a church ledger. He leafed through the book briefly before setting it down. These items, have they been moved since her death? No, Miss March said. Everything was left as it was, per Reverend Layton's request. He said it would help provide closure. Indeed, Holmes replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. Just then, the creak of footsteps reached us. A young man in a clerical collar appeared at the door, tall, fair-haired, with a weary expression beneath kind eyes. I am Reverend Layton, he said. You must be Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson. Miss March told me to expect you. Holmes inclined his head. We are grateful for your time, Reverend. We merely wish to understand the circumstances as fully as possible. Layton stepped inside, folding his hands before him. There's little I can offer, I fear. Ruth was loved here. Quiet, reliable, unshakably devoted. Her death came as a shock to us all. Holmes tilted his head. Yet you suspected no foul play. The Reverend's face stiffened. There was no reason to. The doctor who examined her doctor, Cavell, found no injuries, no signs of a struggle, and the vestry door, Holmes prompted, locked. As I told the constable, I had to remove the side panel myself. Only I, Ruth, Miss Vellum, and Mr. Bancroft hold keys. Did all keys open this same door? Yes, identical cuts. Holmes seemed to file that information away. And the day she died, what brought you here to look for her? She had promised to polish the communion chalice and lay out linens for the following service. When she didn't appear at noon prayers, I grew concerned. She was never late. Holmes nodded slowly, then gestured to the corner. You removed the panel from that window? Yes, a pane of amber glass, easy to lift out. I reached in and unlatched the bolt. She was seated just there. His voice softened. Her eyes were closed. We fell into silence for a moment, broken only by the distant ticking of the church clock. Holmes finally asked, was anything unusual about the Bible when you found it? The Reverend frowned. Not to my knowledge. It lay beside her on the table, closed. I placed it with her handbag and gave it to Miss March once the constables were done. Holmes nodded again. Has anyone else handled it since? Only Miss March, I believe. His voice faltered slightly. Why? Holmes offered no answer, only a faint smile. Just a point of curiosity. We left the church soon after, promising to return later to speak with the other two keyholders. As we walked down the narrow path that led back toward the road, I ventured to ask, "What did you see, Holmes?" He pulled his collar close against the wind. "Several things, Watson. But the first reserve judgment until I've seen the faces of Miss Vellum and Mr. Bancroft, and until I've had a chance to examine the church records more thoroughly. You suspect one of them. I suspect that the truth often lies beneath what is not said. Miss March brought us a lipstick mark, but it is silence that may hold the deeper stain. And so we return to Baker Street, the case having only begun to unravel. I could not help but glance back at the church's dark spire rising into the gray sky. There was something uneasy in its stillness, as though the building itself were holding its breath. Chapter 3: The Organist's Hands. The following morning, we returned to Hampstead under skies heavy with autumn cloud. Holmes had spent the prior evening in quiet reflection, barely speaking a word, save for a brief question about the nature of aged varnish on wood equerry, which seemed, at the time, disconnected from the matter at hand. He rose early, pressed and sharpened, and led the way without the slightest delay. The carriage ride passed in silence, the wheels crunching over damp leaves as the church loomed once again through the swirling mist at St. Michael's. We were greeted not by Miss March or Reverend Layton, but by a young woman in a violet shawl who was already seated at the organ bench. Her back was straight, posture impeccable, and her hands moved across the keys. In silence, no music came, only the gesture of playing. She turned at our approach, her eyes a piercing blue that seemed to judge before they welcomed. "Miss Vellum, Holmes said with a nod. "You are the organist, I believe." "And you must be Mr. Holmes," she replied, her voice clipped and precise. "Reverend Layton mentioned you might return. I must admit, I am surprised you would involve yourself in a matter that the police have already closed." Holmes smiled faintly. "Sometimes the absence of crime is the very puzzle." He stepped closer, glancing toward her fingers. "You practice silently." "I commit fingerings to memory before striking a note," she said. "It sharpens the ear to imagine rather than indulge." Holmes gave a pleased hum. "Discipline of that sort is rare. May I ask where were you on the day Miss March was found?" "In the choir loft," she said without pause. "I arrived an hour before the midday bell to rehearse a passage from Elgar's Ave Verum. I saw no one. I heard only the wind." Watson and I exchanged a glance. "You did not see Miss March enter?" I asked. "No," she answered, "though I believe she was already inside. I heard the vestry door close some time earlier, perhaps before I arrived." "And you did not think to check?" Holmes asked mildly. Miss Vellum's brow lifted. "We are not children, Mr. Holmes. Ruth was a grown woman with her own duties. I had mine." Holmes moved to the pews, fingers trailing lightly across the edge of the carved oak. "Did you know her well?" "As well as one does anyone in a church," Miss Vellum replied. "We had spoken, of course. She was kind, pious, gentle but painfully dull. No appetite for conversation beyond matters of liturgy and linens." She turned back to the organ, adjusting a sheet of music with unnecessarily sharp precision. "We were not close." Holmes studied her a moment, then glanced at the stone tiles beneath her bench. "You live nearby." "In the rectory's upper rooms." The Reverend allows it for convenience. The choir has late practices during Lent, and Mr. Bancroft, Holmes asked. He comes and goes as he pleases, keeps keys, signs, donation ledgers, makes small comments that no one listens to. A necessary formality. Has he been acting strangely? I asked, but she only gave a dry smile. Mr. Bancroft has been strange since birth, I suspect. Then, as if to deflect the subject, she asked, "You've come about the Bible, haven't you?" Holmes did not react, but his attention sharpened. "You've heard? Reverend Layton told me Miss March found something disturbing, a mark of some kind." She tilted her head slightly. "It's true, then?" Holmes only said it was there. "That is all I will confirm for now." Miss Vellum looked away, her mouth tight. I never understood why Ruth clung to that book. The pages were lined in gold, the binding fragile, but she never replaced it. She carried it like a relic. "And now it has become one," Holmes murmured. "But relics are often touched by more than time." We took our leave soon after, but not before Holmes paused beside the choir stalls. He ran a finger along a small brass hook affixed to the inside of the wall, its presence subtle. "Strange," he said softly. "The hook is polished on one side and dusty on the other." "Perhaps it holds a robe," I offered. "Possibly," he said. "Or perhaps something else was hung here, something that has recently been removed." Outside, the air had grown colder, and the mist had thickened. Holmes lit his pipe as we turned toward the vicarage, where Mr. Bancroft was said to take his tea at precisely 11. "What do you make of her?" I asked, still troubled by the organist's measured disdain. "A woman who has grown accustomed to secrets, and to silences that are entirely of her own choosing. She plays music with invisible fingers, and speaks only in measured keys. People like that often hear more than they admit." We approached the vicarage just as a tall man in a gray overcoat exited its front gate, pausing to adjust his gloves. His face was long, his hair slicked back to a precise parting, and he moved with the overbearing care of someone used to being watched. "Mr. Bancroft, I believe," Holmes said, raising a hand. The man looked at us with a thin-lipped smile. "Yes, and you are the detectives." "One hopes so," Holmes said. "Might we have a moment?" Mr. Bancroft led us into a modest drawing-room filled with ecclesiastical oddities, brass candelabra, woodcut prints of obscure saints, and a glass case of ancient hymnal. He gestured toward a pair of chairs and sat opposite, crossing his legs with a deliberate slowness. "I heard about the lipstick," he said. Miss March was understandably upset. Holmes's eyebrows rose. "You already knew." "Reverend Layton mentioned it yesterday evening." "The parish is small, Mr. Holmes. We share our grief efficiently." Holmes's voice remained light. "And do you share your suspicions as easily?" Mr. Bancroft blinked, but his tone did not falter. "I do not deal in suspicions. I deal in facts. And the fact is, Ruth March died quietly in a locked room. If some trinket of hers was altered afterward, it only suggests someone with a fondness for theatrics." I found myself watching Holmes closely then. Something about Bancroft's phrasing, "a trinket," seemed to settle in Holmes's mind like a piece clicking into place. But he made no reaction. "Tell me," he said casually, "did Miss March ever receive visitors? Strangers? Letters?" "Only the church post. Bibles do not attract correspondence." unless they are used to convey something else, Holmes said, standing. Thank you, Mr. Bancroft. We may speak again. And with that, we stepped once more into the mist, with more questions than answers clinging to our coats. But Holmes's eyes now gleamed with a flicker of certainty, as if a thread, nearly invisible, had just begun to pull tight. Chapter 4. The dust on the ledger. By the time we returned to the church that afternoon, the rain had begun to fall soft, steady, and cold. Holmes said nothing during the short walk from the vicarage, his collar turned up against the drizzle, his face drawn tight in thought. I had long since learned not to interrupt him during these inward spells. His eyes, though, were not vacant. They moved constantly, flicking from paving stone to rusted hinge, from shutter to window pane. He was watching the world as though it might, at any moment, make a mistake and reveal the truth. The church was empty when we arrived. Miss Vellum had retired to her quarters, and Reverend Layton was away at a hospital visit. Holmes moved with purpose, leading us not toward the vestry, but into the narrow hallway that ran behind the chancel. There, in a small wooden cabinet tucked beneath an arch, lay the parish ledger, the thick, leather-bound book in which all church activities, expenses, and appointments were logged. It sat beside a box of unused votive candles and a half-empty bottle of brass polish. Tomps opened the ledger carefully, using his handkerchief. The pages were heavy, yellowing at the edges. These were updated by Ruth March, he murmured. She was meticulous. Let us see if she left behind any notes the others failed to interpret. He turned the pages slowly, eyes darting over the entries. The handwriting was neat, an upright teach letter, carefully shaped. Weddings, funerals, flower orders, hymn selections. Nothing amiss. But then he stopped. He had reached a page dated 2 days before Ruth's death. An entry written in her hand had been blotted out, not erased, but scraped lightly with a blade, then overwritten with the words, "Cancelled choir practice." Holmes tilted the book toward the light. Look here, Watson. You can just make out the original ink beneath the scratches. I leaned in, squinting. The original words were faint, but they had not vanished. Meeting with SVI, late donations. SVI, said Sarah Vellum. Indeed, Holmes replied. And look at the replacement entry. It is a fiction. There was no choir practice scheduled for that afternoon. The real choir rehearsals occur on Thursdays and Sundays only. But why scratch it out? I asked. And who would know to conceal such a thing? Someone who reads the ledger, Holmes said simply. Someone who feared that entry would betray them. He closed the book gently, as though not to disturb a sleeping thing, and replaced it in the cupboard. We returned to the vestry, and Holmes stood once more by the window panel that had been removed to unlock the room. The rain tapped softly against the stained glass. Watson, he said after a pause, do you remember the hook I noticed near the choir stalls? Yes. You thought something had been recently removed from it. Precisely. I believe it once held a stola ceremonial scarf worn by clergy, but not one in regular use. The dust line suggests it had hung there undisturbed for quite some time, until the week of Ruth March's death. He moved toward the cupboard at the back of the vestry and opened it. Inside were a few altar linens, a chalice, and 2 stoles, one gold, one violet. Holmes touched each briefly, then stepped back. Neither has the right imprint. There was a third. You believe someone took it? Yes, and I believe it played a role in the message left in the Bible. But for now, that detail remains unresolved. Before I could press him further, the church door creaked open behind us. It was Reverend Layton, damp from the rain, carrying a folded umbrella and wearing a troubled expression. "You're still here," he said. "I must confess, this investigation has stirred unease among the parishioners. Some say it is wrong to pry into Ruth's memory." "Truth," Holmes replied, "has never once disturbed the dead, only the living." The vicar hesitated. "I came to bring you something. I found it in the back of Ruth's cupboard at the rectory. It must have been placed there recently." He handed Holmes a small envelope, dote, unmarked, sealed with plain wax. Holmes opened it and removed a single sheet of notepaper. There were only 3 words, printed in red ink. "You saw nothing." I felt a chill crawl along my spine. Holmes stared at the paper for a long moment, then passed it to me. "Someone is rattled," he said, "and frightened enough to resort to warnings." "Red ink," I muttered. "Not lipstick, but deliberate, like a signature without a name." Holmes nodded. "And Ruth had no enemies, we are told. No lovers, no secrets. But someone thought she saw something, and feared she might speak." Reverend Layton looked pale. "I didn't report this to the police. I thought it might be... nothing." Holmes looked at him sharply. "You were wrong. It is very much something." We walked with the vicar back into the nave, where the final light of afternoon filtered dimly through the stained glass figures. The silence had grown heavier, as though the church itself were listening. Holmes paused at the chancel rail, staring up toward the choir loft. "We must return tomorrow," he said softly. "I need to observe the organist again." Something in her hands. Something she did not mean to show. I looked at him in surprise. "You noticed something yesterday." "I noticed what she did not do," he replied, "and it may be the clearest mark of guilt we've seen." We parted from Reverend Layton at the gate, and as we rode back to Baker Street through the evening fog, Holmes said little. But once inside, he spread the ledger page, the envelope, and a clean sketch he had drawn of the vestry's interior upon the table. He studied them all with the intensity of a man examining a battlefield from above. Then, with quiet certainty, he said, "The Bible was not the first message. It was the second." I frowned. "And the first?" Holmes tapped his pencil against the drawing of the vestry floor. "The first was left in silence. But if we read it properly, it speaks volumes." Chapter 5. The red herring in the choir loft the following morning broke cold and bright, with the fog of the past days finally lifting to reveal a brittle clarity over the rooftops. Holmes, ever drawn to moments of stillness before revelation, delayed our return to Hampstead by an hour, saying only that he wished to let the morning settle its dust. He spent the time sorting through a pile of church directories and newsletters that had been sent from the vicarage, skimming them with the detachment of a chess master reviewing past games. At last, with no announcement, he rose, donned his coat, and motioned for me to follow. The case, I sensed, had turned its first real corner. St. Michael's looked less ghostly in the sunlight, though no less severe. The stone walls, washed clean by rain, now showed cracks and lichen more clearly. Holmes paused outside, his gaze flickering along the guttering, then upward toward the modest bell tower. "Watson," he said without turning, "does anything strike you about this church?" beyond the lingering unease. "No, it is small," he said, "and yet it carries secrets like a cathedral." Inside, we found Miss Vellum once again seated at the organ bench. She was playing this time slowly, solemnly the opening bars of Jesu, joy of man's desiring. Her touch was gentle, but I noticed a small tremble in her wrist as Holmes approached. She stopped playing before he even spoke. "Miss Vellum," he said warmly, "may we speak again, briefly?" She turned her head, her face unreadable. "I suppose you've come to ask about the envelope." Holmes smiled faintly. "No, about your hands." There was a pause, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "My hands?" "Yes. Yesterday, you played without sound finger exercises, you claimed. Today, you play in earnest. But you always wear gloves outdoors, do you not?" She looked down, as though realizing her bare fingers had been exposed too long. "It's cold," she said quickly. "I am careful not to strain the joints." "Quite so," Holmes agreed. "And yet I notice that your left thumb bears a faint smear of red hardly visible now. A trace of pigment, I believe. It caught my attention only because it wasn't there the day before." Miss Vellum stiffened. "You're implying something absurd, Mr. Holmes, am I? Let us suppose someone wished to send a message to apply lipstick to a surface carefully, without drawing attention. A woman who rarely wore cosmetics would find it awkward." She didn't respond. Holmes took a slow step forward. "Or perhaps someone else applied it. Someone who handled the Bible just long enough to leave the mark and replace it in the handbag. But they would need privacy and access." "I never touched it," she said quickly, too quickly. "That book meant nothing to me." "Which is precisely why you're interesting," Holmes replied. "Because you had no sentimental reason to be near it yet. I suspect you were. And I believe Ruth March found out. Perhaps that's why she scratched out the entry in the ledger. Not because she wished to lie, but because she feared the truth would not be understood in time." Miss Vellum rose from the bench, her face pale. "This is madness, is it?" Holmes stepped back, giving her space. "Then tell me, where were you between 5 and 6 on the night Ruth died?" She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Holmes turned slightly. "You see, Watson, our red herring has just begun to smell of perfume." At that moment, the vestry door opened, and Reverend Leighton entered, clearly alarmed by the tension in the air. "Miss Vellum," he asked, "is everything all right?" "Quite," Holmes said pleasantly. "We were just discussing music." The Reverend looked between us, frowning. "I've received word," he said cautiously. "Inspector Brent from the yard is coming this afternoon." Miss March filed a formal complaint after discovering a second note in Ruth's cupboard. "They say it was slid behind the baseboard." He handed it to Holmes, a folded scrap of paper. "This one scrawled in the same red ink as the first. The silence is safer." Holmes read it carefully, then passed it to me. "A pattern," he said, "not random. The author is methodical, perhaps rehearsed. A person who thinks in symbols, not rage." "But why Ruth?" I asked. "She was harmless, devout, too devout," Holmes said softly. "She may have seen something in the church, something that violated her sense of sacred order, something that was not meant to be seen." Reverend Leighton looked troubled. "Do you believe she was killed?" Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. But I believe someone feared she might speak and left these warnings to frighten others into silence." We stepped outside a short time later, leaving Miss Vellum with the Reverend. Holmes walked slowly toward the edge of the graveyard, where a low wall ran along the back of the property. There he paused, staring at a patch of disturbed soil near the roots of an old yew tree. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you see those footprints?" I looked. Yes, someone stood here recently. "But why?" "Because from this angle," he replied, "you can see directly into the vestry window through the stained glass panel that was removed." My breath caught. "You think someone watched her?" "Not just watched," Holmes said grimly. "They waited. Ruth may have locked the door, but she left the panel loose for air. Someone could have reached inside if they wished. Someone could have left the Bible exactly where she would find it." We turned to leave, but Holmes's voice stopped me. "Tomorrow we return again, not to speak, not to accuse, but to test a theory." I looked at him carefully. "What theory?" "That guilt," he said, "leaves behind not just traces but rhythms. And soon enough, someone will fall out of step." Chapter 6: The Stole and the Silence. The next morning dawned with a heavy sky and the scent of damp earth lingering in the air. Holmes and I made our way back to Hampstead, this time on foot from the station, Holmes insisting that the rhythm of walking sharpened his mind. He said little, but I could feel the tension gathering in him, quiet as a bowstring, stretched and waiting. There was something different in his manner. Not quite excitement, but a deepening certainty, like a man nearing the final corner of a winding path. When we arrived at St. Michael's, the churchyard was empty and still, the stone steps slick with dew. Holmes paused at the threshold, eyes drifting once more toward the choir loft before he stepped inside. Reverend Layton met us at the back pews, looking drawn and wearied. "The inspector has come and gone," he said softly. "He found nothing actionable in the notes, called them odd but harmless, and recommended we keep watch for any further disturbances." Holmes only nodded. Sometimes the law deals in weight, not in shape. But the shape of a threat, how it curves through silence, is the thing that truly matters. Layton gave him a strained look, then turned to go, leaving us alone in the hushed expanse of the nave. Holmes moved toward the vestry, his gaze flicking upward toward the loft. "She will not play today," he said suddenly. "She'll be watching instead. That will tell us more." We stepped into the vestry once more, the small room unchanged in its solemn arrangement. Holmes went directly to the cupboard, opened it, and began removing the folded stoles and linens one by one. He examined them not as garments, but as objects, sifting for weight, for scent, for absence. "There was a third stole here," he said, his voice low. "I saw the hook. I saw the shape of the dust around it. It was removed, perhaps destroyed. I watched as he unfolded the violet stole again, holding it to the light. This one," he said, "still has the faint trace of incense, but no wax, no lipstick, no ink. It's been used regularly." He placed it aside. "But the missing one, it was part of the scene Ruth walked into." He turned back to the table in the center of the room. "Watson," he said, gesturing, "do you recall how Miss March described her sister's position when found?" "Seated upright, as if she'd fallen asleep," I answered. "Precisely. Yet the chair is low, the wall behind it hard. It is not a posture one assumes, unless direct a door, unless something in the room struck her into stillness." He knelt beside the chair, fingers brushing along the edge of the stone wall. no sign of struggle. But fear can still kill, can it not? Especially in one with a quiet heart. Just then, the door creaked behind us. I turned and saw Miss Vellum standing there, her hands clasped tightly before her. She looked calmer than before, cold, even, but her eyes betrayed something unsteady beneath the surface. "Am I interrupting?" she asked. Holmes rose slowly. "On the contrary, I was hoping you might join us." She stepped inside, glancing at the table, then the cupboard, then finally at the empty hook beside the choir stalls. "Still chasing ghosts, Mr. Holmes." "Ghosts do not write notes in red ink," Holmes replied, "nor do they smear lipstick on sacred texts. That requires a human hand and intent." She looked away. "You still believe it was me?" Holmes said nothing. He simply crossed the room and took up Ruth March's Bible once more, now enclosed in a protective envelope. This book was returned to Miss March 2 days after her sister's death. Within it a kiss, not a smudge, not a careless print, but a deliberate, centered impression, made with care, made to be found. Miss Vellum's voice was flat. "I already told you I never wore lipstick. Not then, not now." "And yet," Holmes said, "I believe someone used a stole to carry the Bible from the vestry. Hidden, wrapped like a gift, or perhaps a weapon. When Ruth entered, she found someone waiting. And though the body showed no marks of violence, something happened in this room that made her heart stop." She stepped forward then, eyes narrowing. "You think I frightened her to death?" "I think," Holmes said gently, "that someone created an illusion to punish her for what she may have seen or overheard. Something she had no words to report. A lipstick mark, yes, but more than that. The fear of a truth beyond her grasp. And I believe you were involved, Miss Vellum, though I do not yet know why." She was quiet for a moment, then turned abruptly and walked from the room, the echo of her steps sharp on the stone floor. Holmes did not follow. He turned instead toward the cupboard again, this time pulling free a rolled altar cloth from the bottom shelf. Inside it, folded with unusual precision, was a small glass vial, nearly invisible against the linen. He held it up. "Not lipstick," he murmured. "Red ink thickened with oil. The kind used in illuminated manuscripts. Old, but still potent." I stepped closer. "Then it wasn't cosmetic at all?" "No," Holmes said. "It was art, or at least something meant to look like art. A staged moment created with reverence, or perhaps blasphemy. Either way, it wasn't improvised. It was planned." We walked slowly back into the nave. The light was thinning again, the sun drifting behind thickening clouds. Holmes stood beneath the stained-glass window above the altar, his voice quiet. "The question is no longer who made the mark. It is who wanted it seen, who arranged the scene so carefully, only to warn others away after." "And what does that suggest to you?" I asked. He looked at me, and his eyes were cold, now not cruel, but narrowed with focus. "It suggests that Ruth March was not the first person to see something. She was the first who could not unsee it. And someone feared that moment of recognition more than they feared death itself." We left the church as the bells began to toll the hour. Their sound was hollow, suspended in the air like unanswered questions. And somewhere behind the stained-glass saints and the organ's silence, the truth remained veiled, waiting to speak. But only when Holmes was ready to listen. Chapter 7. the witness who never spoke the next morning. Holmes rose earlier than usual, and by the time I joined him at breakfast, he was already dressed, coat buttoned and gloves in hand. He looked more drawn than usual, though his movements remained purposeful. "Watson," he said, without looking up from the newspaper folded beside his plate. "We returned to Hampstead, but not to speak to Miss Vellum or Reverend Leighton. Today we call on someone who has not yet spoken at all." I raised an eyebrow. "And who might that be?" "A witness who cannot lie," he replied, taking up his hat. "The caretaker of the dead." We arrived at the gates of Hampstead Cemetery just before 10 o'clock. The clouds hung low over the rows of old stones, and the autumn leaves crackled underfoot. The churchyard extended along the back of St. Michael's, divided by a narrow iron fence that had long since rusted to a dark orange. Holmes led us past several winding paths before pausing beside a small, slate-roofed structure, half shed, half office. Inside sat a thin, elderly man with a bent back and watery eyes, brushing dust from a brass lantern. He looked up, startled, as we entered. "You are Mr. Alfred Gryce?" Holmes asked. "Caretaker of the cemetery." The man nodded slowly, setting aside his brush. "I been here 27 years, sir. Look after the stones, tend the soil, fix what breaks." Holmes offered a faint smile. "Then I imagine you've seen much, and remembered more. May we ask you a few questions about the day Miss Ruth March passed?" Mr. Gryce frowned, but gestured for us to sit on the wooden bench beneath the window. "A sad one, that, I found out the next morning. Didn't see much the night before, 'cept for a shadow near the yew tree." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "What time?" "Close to 6, I reckon. Light was fading. I'd locked up the lower gates and was heading back when I noticed someone standing near the vestry wall. Not moving, just still. Thought it might be Miss March herself, but the shape was wrong." "Wrong how?" Holmes asked. Gryce scratched his beard. "Taller, thinner, more like a man or a woman in trousers. I didn't see the face. By the time I looked again, they'd gone." "Did you tell anyone?" "Didn't seem important then," he said. "And truth be told, most folks don't much like being told who walks near the graves at night. They think it invites trouble." Holmes said nothing for a moment, then asked, "Do you recall anyone else unusual?" "In the weeks before her death." Gryce's eyes narrowed. "Now that you mention it, there was a stranger. Came twice. Didn't go inside the church, just lingered near the back path, watching. Dressed neat, but not local. I thought it odd, but didn't question him. Thought he might have had a reason." Holmes stood, offering the man a coin, which was politely refused. We thanked him and made our way toward the yew tree, the same spot where the footprints had been found earlier. Holmes crouched there, examining the soil again. "Watson," he murmured, "do you see the gravel along the edge of the fence? It's been disturbed again." I knelt beside him. "Another visit?" "Likely," Holmes said. "And see here, pressed into the soft patch near the root, a heel mark, deep, not from Mr. Gryce." I nodded slowly. They returned, perhaps to ensure nothing had been left behind. Holmes didn't answer, but remained crouched, eyes fixed on the church's rear window. After a long silence, he rose. "Come, Watson. There is one more soul I wish to speak to, and if she is as quiet as I suspect, we may yet hear what Ruth March could not say." To my surprise, we returned not to the vestry, but to the choir loft. Holmes ascended the narrow stairwell with care, each step creaking beneath us. The loft was still, the organ keys covered by a velvet cloth. Holmes walked the length of the small space, stopping only when he reached a narrow bench near the rail. It overlooked the nave and, more crucially, the vestry door. "This," he said quietly, "is where Miss Vellum claimed to be during Ruth March's final hour." I glanced around, but she said she saw nothing. "Yes," Holmes replied, "but she also claimed to have heard only the wind. And yet, from this very spot, one would have heard the vestry door open. And if Ruth had cried out even softly, would have echoed through the rafters." Holmes crouched again, brushing a fingertip along the underside of the bench. He held it up. A faint smear of red dust clung to the skin. "Candle powder," he said, "or perhaps the residue of stained ink." He turned to me, eyes sharp. She was here, and she was not alone. At that moment, a sound from below startled Usa Creek. We stepped quietly to the stairwell and peered down. Miss Vellum stood in the nave, facing the altar, alone. Still, she made no sign that she knew we were above her. Holmes watched for a long time, then turned back toward the loft window. "She returns here even when the church is empty. That is the sign of someone who feels tied to the scene, not just by duty, but by guilt." I followed him down the stairs, but we did not approach her. Instead, we slipped through the side aisle and out into the cool air of midday. Holmes lit a match and spoke quietly as we walked. "She saw Ruth that evening, perhaps even entered the vestry before she died. Whether it was she who left the Bible or someone else, Miss Vellum now guards the truth as if it were part of the liturgy. But the problem with silence, Watson, is that it cannot bear weight. Eventually, it collapses." I glanced back at the stained glass window. "Then what will we do next?" Holmes did not answer at first. Then he said, "We test the silence and see who flinches." Chapter 8. A note beneath the candlestick. The following day brought with it a sharp wind and skies thick with gray. And yet Holmes moved with a quiet intensity that seemed untouched by the weather. He had not spoken much the evening before, though I had seen him penning something by candlelight, carefully folding a page and sealing it with a small blot of wax. When I asked him about it, he only said, "Tomorrow will require a performance. The stage must be set carefully." Now, as we boarded the train once again for Hampstead, I could feel the weight of that same intent pressing in. Holmes sat opposite me, his eyes half-lidded but alert, the sealed paper resting in his coat pocket like a trap set with bait. We arrived just past the midday hour, and the church was still and empty when we entered. Holmes walked immediately to the altar, where the candles had been prepared for the evening's choir practice. He removed the center candlestick, placed the folded note beneath it, and then carefully set the metal holder back on top. "What does it say?" I asked. "It says," Holmes replied, "that Ruth March's killer has been identified and will be exposed by name tonight." I stared at him. "But that's not true. You haven't said who did it." "No," Holmes replied softly, "but someone believes I might, and fear is the final piece I need." We waited near the side chapel, concealed from view but with full sight of the altar. The hours passed slowly, the filtered light through the stained glass windows shifting from silver to amber. Just after 3 o'clock, Miss Vellum entered the nave. She walked slowly, reverently, her gloved hands clasped in front of her. Holmes did not move. We watched as she ascended the steps, approached the altar, and paused before the center candle. She adjusted its wick, smoothed the cloth beneath it, and then very gently lifted it from its base. She paused when she saw the note, eyes narrowing. She took it quickly, unfolded it, and read in silence. Then she looked up straight toward the nave, as if sensing she was being observed. Holmes stepped forward quietly, revealing himself before she could turn. "You've read it," he said. Her face was very still. "Yes, then I imagine you know what must be done." She held the paper tightly. "What do you mean to accuse me of?" "Nothing," Holmes said calmly. "But I believe you mean to accuse someone else. And the time has come to decide whether you will remain complicit or step into the light." She said nothing. Her eyes dropped to the folded note in her hand. Then, wordlessly, she walked past him and disappeared into the vestry. Holmes let her go, watching her steps until she vanished through the wooden door. "What now?" I asked. "Now," Holmes said, "we wait for her to speak, or for someone to silence her before she can." We remained in the shadows of the church for another hour, but Miss Vellum did not return. When the door to the vestry finally creaked open again, it was Reverend Layton who stepped out. He looked shaken. "She's gone," he said. "Left the church by the rear path. Her belongings are still upstairs, but she left this on the table." He handed Holmes a sheet of lined stationery, folded once. The handwriting was precise and angled. Holmes read it in silence, then passed it to me. "I never meant for Ruth to die. I only meant to frighten her. I thought the lipstick would unnerve her, not stop her heart. I thought she would tell no one. I didn't write the second note. I swear it," she confesses. I said. "Partly," Holmes replied. "She admits to placing the lipstick mark but denies the rest, which tells me this is no simple matter. There is another hand at work, one that guided hers or followed it." Holmes stood still for several moments, his gaze turning slowly toward the darkened rear pews of the church. "Watson," he said quietly, "I need you to go to the caretaker. Ask him who entered the back gate today. Ask if he saw anyone besides Miss Vellum. There's a piece missing, something neither she nor the Reverend has yet seen fit to share." I did as instructed, finding Mr. Gryce tidying fallen branches near the fence. He remembered seeing Miss Vellum depart by the rear path, walking quickly with her head down. But more curiously, he also mentioned seeing Mr. Bancroft earlier that afternoon, long before Miss Vellum entered. "He was in a hurry," Gryce said. "Went round back, near the crypt wall. Odd time for a visit." I returned with this news, and Holmes received it with a deepening stillness. "Of course," he murmured. "Mr. Bancroft, the quiet steward of the church, always present, always forgettable, but never truly absent." We returned to the vestry, where Holmes once again inspected the cupboard. He removed each item carefully until he found a folded stole tucked behind the inner panel. It was the missing one, plain white silk, though now stained faintly at the hem with a reddish bloom. He held it up. She did not keep it. He did, perhaps as a token, or perhaps because he knew it might link him to something he dared not explain. Before I could ask what he meant, we heard footsteps behind us. Bancroft stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I suppose it's too late to act innocent now," he said quietly. "Indeed," Holmes replied, "but not too late to tell the truth. Bancroft walked forward, slowly. I didn't kill her, Holmes. I never touched her. But I told Sarah that Ruth had begun asking questions. I told her about the letters Ruth had found in the record's old correspondences from a former vicar, ones that mentioned a scandal long buried. Holmes said nothing, allowing the silence to pull the rest of the confession forth. Sarah panicked. She thought if she could frighten Ruth into keeping quiet, it would end there. She didn't mean harm. But when Ruth died, ... He paused. I wrote the second note, not to taunt, to stop anyone else from digging further. Holmes nodded once, slowly. You tried to bury the crime beneath symbols, but symbols carry their own weight. You left behind a trail. Bancroft looked down, his hands trembling. What will you do? The decision is not mine, Holmes replied. But understand, truth is not a candle you can snuff out and relight at will. It burns until all shadows are exposed. We stood in silence, the evening light thickening behind the stained glass. Outside, the bells began to toll again, echoing through the nave like a call to judgment. And somewhere, beneath the stillness, the truth had begun to rise at last. Chapter 9. The dust that would not settle the following morning found Holmes unusually still. He sat in the chair by the fireplace at Baker Street, legs crossed, fingertips pressed together, and his gaze fixed on the curling smoke from his pipe. The confession from Bancroft had, in part, opened the path ahead, but not all of it. There was something unfinished, still lingering in the air, a note unresolved, in a melody otherwise descending toward silence. I prepared the morning tea and waited, knowing from long habit that Holmes would speak only when ready. At last he leaned forward, set his pipe aside, and said, Watson, Miss Vellum is hiding again, but not in flight, in fear. She knows more than she's confessed, and I believe she's now afraid of what Bancroft might yet do if pushed further. I set down my cup. But you believe Bancroft told the truth? Only in the parts that served to shield him, Holmes said. He admits to writing the second note, yes, but not to his presence at the vestry on the night Ruth March died. And yet, we have Gryce's word, he was there. He claims he warned Sarah, and that may be true. But I suspect he did more than warn. He orchestrated. Holmes rose and crossed the room to the small table where he had laid out the church's document scopies of old parish correspondences, torn ledger fragments, and transcripts Holmes had requested from the diocesan office. These letters Ruth found, sent decades ago from a former vicar. They reference something quieted after scandal, a clergyman removed under suspicion, and a young woman dismissed. The names are veiled, but the pattern repeats. He handed me a page, and I read the line in the vicar's neat hand. She returned again last night. The girl insists the ledger was altered. I told her it was unwise to dwell on shadows. Some stones should remain unturned. I looked up Holmes. Do you believe Ruth discovered this same story repeating? He nodded. I believe she found evidence of financial misappropriation tied to past sins. And I believe Bancroft, who controls those ledgers now, feared the full history would rise. So he whispered to Miss Vellum, feeding her fear, shaping her reaction until her small deception grew teeth. That afternoon, we returned once more to Hampstead. The church stood beneath a silver sky, the bells silent, the doors unlocked. Inside, It was cold and dim. Miss Phelim was not at the organ, nor did Bancroft appear in the vicar's office. We found Reverend Leighton pacing the aisle, his expression taut with worry. "She's vanished again," he said. "Sarah left her rooms this morning before sunrise. No note this time, and Bancroft has not returned since yesterday." Holmes's jaw tightened. "Then we must find her before he does." He turned quickly, motioning for me to follow, and we exited the church through the rear, crossing into the cemetery. Mr. Gryce was not in his usual place, but the door to the caretaker's hut. Holmes approached, knocked once, and entered. Inside, the old man was seated in his chair, pale and shivering, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. "She came here," he said, before Holmes could even ask. "Miss Phelim, just before dawn. Asked me to hide her." "Where is she now?" Holmes asked calmly. Gryce hesitated, then pointed toward the back of the grounds. "There's a small tool cellar beneath the east wall. No one's used it in years. She's there." Holmes nodded and set off at once, and I followed him across the uneven ground. We reached a crumbling stone outbuilding, half sunken into the hillside. Holmes knocked softly on the rusted door. "Miss Phelim," he said, "it's Holmes. You are safe." There was a pause, then a shuffling sound. The door creaked open, and she appeared in the gap, her face wan, her hands trembling. "He came last night," she whispered. "He said I'd brought it all upon myself, that if I just kept quiet, it would all fade again. But it hasn't, Mr. Holmes. It's worse. I dream about her sitting there with that book. I see her face." Holmes stepped gently forward. "Did Bancroft threaten you?" She nodded. "He told me to leave London. Said there was money if I did, but I knew if I left, he'd tell everyone I had confessed. He'd make me the only villain." Holmes looked at her with the calm of a man who has already placed the final piece. "You placed the mark," he said, "but Bancroft created the moment. He guided your fear and ensured Ruth would be alone in the vestry, believing herself safe." She shivered. "I only meant to startle her, I thought. I thought she'd speak to me about what she found, but I was too late. She was already afraid. She'd seen him, I think seen him, near the old records. She didn't tell me, but she looked ... hollow." Holmes helped her out into the daylight. "You will come with us," he said. "You will speak to the inspector, and I will ensure you are heard fairly." She said nothing, but she followed as we walked her back toward the vicarage. The church bell above us tolled once, echoing like a judgment in the gray air. Holmes turned to me as we passed beneath its shadow. The lipstick was a warning. The notes were threats. But the silence, Watson, the silence was a weapon. Bancroft knew fear would spread faster than any accusation, and he nearly succeeded. We turned the final corner, the church behind us, the stone path damp beneath our feet. Holmes's coat flared in the wind, and he stopped once more, glancing back toward the vestry. "There is still one thing I don't yet understand," I said. "Why didn't Bancroft just destroy the ledger? Why risk Ruth discovering the letters at all?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "Because arrogance, my dear Watson, always believes itself invisible, until the dust refuses to settle." Chapter 10. The choir that never sang the wind grew colder as we returned Miss Phelim to the safety of the vicarage, where Reverend Leighton received her with a mixture of quiet concern and helplessness. He had, throughout the ordeal, remained a passive figure, more witness than participant, and Holmes studied him for a long moment before speaking. "She must not be left alone again," he said gently, almost as if delivering a sermon himself. "The matter is not yet closed, but she is no longer your danger." Leighton nodded, eyes downcast, as if the church's weight had finally found his shoulders. Holmes turned away without further word, and we stepped once more into the chill of Hampstead's fading afternoon. It was nearly 5 o'clock. The daylight thinned with every passing moment, and the lanterns along the cemetery wall were already being lit. Holmes led us not toward the station, but back into the church, his pace unhurried, his thoughts wrapped in silence. The nave was deserted, the choir loft empty. Holmes climbed the stairs once more, stopping at the wooden rail where Miss Vellum had once sat. "Watson," he said quietly, "there's something about this place that has bothered me from the beginning, not just what was done, but what was not. Consider, this choir loft, high above the nave, facing the altar, affords perfect visibility, and yet no one ever speaks of the choir. There are benches, yes, an organ, but no rehearsal notes, no robes, no schedule posted." I looked around, slowly seeing it through his eyes. The space felt like a stage left unused for too long, the dust gathered in corners, the books untouched. "You think there hasn't been a choir for some time?" "I know there hasn't," he said. "The ledgers list names for collection donations, not for practice. Miss Vellum is the organist, but she is also, by necessity, the entire music department." He tapped one of the hymnals. "These haven't been turned in months." And yet Bancroft insisted that cancelled choir practice was a reasonable replacement entry for the altered ledger. He was counting on the lie being overlooked. We descended again, and Holmes walked straight to the vestry, his boots echoing across the stones. There, he knelt by the small wall cupboard and lifted the heavy ledger once more. "The meeting Ruth intended with Miss Vellum," he said, flipping pages, "was not to discuss music. It was to discuss donations, specifically large ones made in the name of a choir that does not exist." He paused and then traced his finger along the margin of the page. "Look here, Watson." A faint impression ink seeped through from a folded letter placed above it. These entries were used to conceal another document. Perhaps a letter Ruth found, perhaps one she never had time to read. We took the ledger and made our way back to Baker Street by dusk. Holmes wasted no time. By the light of the fire, he steamed open the ledgers, binding along the inner edge. From within, carefully hidden inside the spine, he withdrew a folded page, stained with glue and age. He spread it gently across the table. The writing was delicate, the ink faded but legible. Holmes read aloud. "To the one who finds this, if I am not believed, so be it. But I cannot look upon the altar again without shame. I signed the false donations to protect someone." He said the choir brought hope, but there is no choir. There hasn't been one for years. And yet the money kept arriving, and I was told to say nothing. I regret what I signed, but I will not sign again. Ruth M. Holmes sat back. "There it is," he said. "A confession not of guilt, but of compliance. She helped hide the fraud for a time, but something changed. Perhaps it was the rediscovery of old letters, or perhaps her conscience simply woke. Either way, she meant to tell someone, and Bancroft knew it. I felt the weight of the words settle into the room. "But why the lipstick?" I asked. "Why that symbol?" Holmes's voice dropped. "Because Ruth's faith was her core. A lipstick mark on her Bible was not merely shocking, it was profane. It would stun her, silence her, make her feel desecrated. And if someone wished to stop her from revealing a truth too large to contain, what better way than to strike at her deepest belief?" He folded the letter carefully, replaced it into the envelope, and sealed it. But Bancroft miscalculated. Ruth's heart failed, yes, but her silence did not last. It left echoes through Sarah, through the ledgers, through the very stillness of this church. We returned to the church the next morning for the final time. The inspector had been summoned, and Holmes placed the sealed evidence in his hand with quiet authority. Bancroft had not fled. He was arrested just after sunrise. In his rooms above the parish hall, a suitcase, half-packed, the stolen funds traced through a network of false donors he himself had created. He said little as they led him away. Only once did he glance toward the church, and when he did, his eyes were not repentant, but empty, like someone who had spent years inside a lie and no longer knew how to breathe truth. Miss Vellum, for her part, chose to remain in London. She agreed to testify, and though her part in the matter was damning, it was not criminal. She had been used, and she knew it. Her voice was firmer now. The trembling had lessened, but I saw something in her that would not soon heal. As Holmes and I left St. Michael's for the last time, I turned once more to the altar, where the candles now burned clean and steady. The church was not silent now. There was something in the air, perhaps only the creak of the wood or the whisper of wind through stained glass, but it felt less haunted. The truth, once spoken, had changed the sound of everything. "Do you suppose," I asked Holmes as we crossed the graveyard path, "that Ruth found peace in the end?" Holmes was quiet a moment, then said, "She spoke, Watson. Even in death she found a way to speak, and those who listen will hear her still." And so we left the church behind, the bells quiet, the choir loft empty still, but no longer pretending to sing. Chapter 11. The echo kept in stone. The wind was restless as we left Hampstead behind, pulling at the edges of our coats as if unwilling to let us go. The church faded into the mist behind us, its windows pale against the growing dusk, and though the mystery had unraveled to its final knots, Holmes remained pensive. Back at Baker Street, he sat by the hearth in silence, his violin resting untouched beside him. I watched him for some time before speaking, wondering if his mind was still turning over the edges of the case. He had solved it enough that there was no doubt, and yet something in his manner suggested that the shadows had not fully lifted. "Holmes," I said carefully, "you're still troubled." He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Watson, because the resolution we delivered was judicial, not moral. We handed Bancroft to the law. We gave Miss Vellum a measure of freedom. But Ruth Marchie was never meant to be part of it. She became a casualty of silence, not of her own making." He looked toward the window, where raindrops had begun to streak down the glass. "There are crimes that unfold with sharp violence, and others that decay slowly, until what remains is no longer guilt but rot. This was the latter." I nodded slowly, but her words were heard in the end. "They were," Holmes said, "but not by the ones who should have listened while she was still alive." That distinction matters more than we often admit. The following day brought an unexpected visitor, Everend Layton. He arrived with his coat still wet from the rain, a leather folder beneath his arm. Holmes greeted him politely, but did not rise. "I did not expect to see you again, Reverend," he said. "The case is concluded." Layton nodded. "I know, but there's something you ought to see. Something I found in a drawer of Ruth's desk." He passed the folder to Holmes, who opened it carefully. Inside were several pages, most written in Ruth's even careful script. They were drafts of letters, none posted, each addressed not to the church or the authorities, but to a woman named Esther Langford. The same name, I realized, that had appeared in one of the older correspondences Holmes had uncovered during his investigation. "She was a friend," Layton said. "Or more, perhaps, once. She moved away years ago. No one ever mentioned her, but Ruth kept writing." Holmes read in silence. The letters were personal, filled with regret and half-formed confessions. One near the end stood out. It read, "I saw him in the vestry again. I think he was looking through the donation records. The numbers don't add up. I don't know what to do. If you were here, you would know. But I am alone, and I cannot hear what God wants from me." He passed it to me, and I felt the weight of it settle into my chest. Ruth had not simply stumbled upon the truth, she had agonized over it. She had sought guidance in the only place left to her, the memory of a friend long gone. She was searching for strength, I said quietly. And she left behind a map of her fear. Layton looked down. "I wish I had known. I was her priest, but I saw only her duties, not her burden." Holmes gave him a long look. "Your silence was not malevolent, Reverend, but it was part of the same silence that allowed Bancroft to thrive. You must carry that knowledge forward, not as punishment, but as penance." Layton took his leave not long after, the folder clasped tightly in his hands. Holmes stood once he was gone and crossed to the window again. "It always surprises me," he said softly, "how often faith becomes a hiding place for truth. Not because of doctrine, but because people fear what truth might do to the fragile structures they've built." I joined him at the window. The rain had eased, and beyond the rooftops, a faint glow of morning light had begun to rise. "What will become of the church now?" I asked. "The fraud exposed, the scandal emerging." Holmes turned slightly. "It will carry on. They always do. But it may become quieter, more honest, perhaps. If Layton listens closely, he might even give the choir loft purpose again, not with song, but with memory." That evening, Holmes returned to the folded confession Ruth had hidden in the ledger. He reread it, then placed it gently in a fresh envelope, along with a copy of the letter to Esther Langford. "Where will you send it?" I asked. "To her, if she still lives," he replied, "or to the archive of the diocese. Somewhere it will not be lost again. Stories like Ruth's are easily buried, Watson, but they shape the ground beneath our feet." For a long time we sat in quiet, the fire crackling softly, the city beyond our windows drifting toward night. There had been no great villain in this case, no murderer lurking with blade or poison. And yet Ruth March had died all the same, her heart stilled by isolation, her voice nearly swallowed by the very walls she served. In the weeks that followed, Holmes spoke of the case only once more. We were walking along the embankment when he paused, watching the water churn against the peers. "There is a strange sort of justice, Watson," he said. "Not the kind handed down by courts, but the justice found in being remembered. Ruth was no martyr, no heroine, but she held her ground quietly, and now, at least, she does not lie forgotten." I said nothing, but I felt the truth of it. Some echoes are louder than voices. Some names are carved not in stone, but in the stillness that follows them. And in that quiet, Holmes had once again listened where others had not. Chapter 12. A candle left unlit. Nearly 3 weeks had passed since the final arrest at St. Michael's, and though the matter no longer occupied the newspapers, Holmes remained at least inwardly within its silent walls. I noticed it in small ways. He declined invitations even from familiar clients, and he spent more time than usual sorting and restoring old files, often pausing with a faraway look, as though the sound of a page turning might stir the echo of a voice long stilled. I offered distractions, chess, music, even the promise of a short case involving forged naval signals, but Holmes waved them away with a quiet shake of the head. The case of Ruth March, though resolved, had left something in him unsettled. It was not guilt. I had seen Holmes shoulder the moral weight of far darker affairs without a moment's pause. Nor was it grief. It was something quieter than both, and more difficult to name. One evening, as the fire dimmed and the wind outside coiled around the edges of Baker Street, I asked him plainly what lingered. Holmes was sitting cross-legged on the floor, poring through the index of one of his notebooks, when he looked up and answered without hesitation, "The absence, Watson. That is what troubles me still." "Whose absence?" I asked. He turned back to the page. "The choirs, Ruth March's, even Bancroft's. It is as if each played a note in a hymn that was never sung to the end. I cannot help but feel the melody was cut off before it resolved." The following morning brought an unexpected letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, with a postmark from Devon. Holmes opened it slowly, his brow furrowing as he read. Then he handed it to me without a word. The letter was from Esther Langford, the woman to whom Ruth had written. She had received the envelope Holmes had sent, and was writing now to thank him. Her words were gentle and composed, but there was sorrow folded into them, like a flower pressed into old parchment. She wrote of Ruth as a young girl in training, devoted to the cloth but never blind to its failings. She mentioned how they had once sung together before Ruth took her post in Hampstead. But the line that struck Holmes most was near the end. Ruth feared many things, but silence was not one of them. She only ever asked that someone listened. That evening, Holmes did not speak for some time, but as the lamplight deepened and the fire crackled low, he stood abruptly and reached for his coat. "Come, Watson," he said. "I believe we have one last visit to make." I followed him without question, and we took a cab north through the dark streets. Arriving just before closing at the small publishing house where church records were archived, Holmes had made an arrangement, it seemed, for they let us in without challenge, leading us to a back room stacked with ledgers, bound letters, and boxers filled with the paperwork of half-forgotten parish lives. Holmes moved with purpose. He searched for St. Michael's Hampsteadites, older registries, dated well before Ruth's time. After some minutes, he pulled free a volume marked Choral Donations, 1872 to 1891. He opened it and scanned the pages, then another and another. At last he found what he sought, the first mention of the choir being disbanded due to lack of attendance. That was in 1887. Yet, the financial records we had found showed donations continuing as late as 1895. Fraud predates Bancroft, Holmes said softly. He merely inherited it. Perhaps he believed it harmless, a tradition worth preserving in number, if not in sound. But Ruth knew it mattered, I said, because she saw the quiet as part of something wrong. Yes, Holmes replied, and her conscience, however belated, tried to resist it. That is what killed her, Watson, not the mark, not even the fear. It was the knowledge that she had allowed herself to be used and could no longer stay silent. We left the archive just after midnight. The air outside had grown cold, and the fog had begun to gather again, curling between the lampposts like sleep. We walked a while before hailing a cab, and Holmes was deep in thought. "This case will not be remembered like the others," he said suddenly. "There is no great twist, no brilliant trap, no duel of minds, but it will stay with me longer." I looked at him, surprised. "Why this one?" "Because it reminds me that justice is not always a matter of cleverness," he said. "Sometimes it is a matter of choosing to listen when no one else does." When we returned home, he placed the ledger from the archive alongside his own notes and locked them away in a drawer he seldom used. "There," he said, "let it rest, not erased but remembered." In the weeks that followed, Holmes slowly returned to his usual pace. He took cases again, solved riddles with flair and elegance, and his violin sang once more across our rooms. But every now and then I would find him staring out the window when the church bells rang in the distance, not with detachment, but with quiet reverence. And I understood then that Ruth March had not vanished into silence. She had left something behind, a voice, however small, that Holmes had chosen to hear, and in doing so, he had turned one more candle toward the light. Chapter 13. The Bell That Didn't Ring. The woman did not startle. She turned to him slowly. Her eyes were dark and steady. I knew of her. I knew she died alone. Her voice was soft, but not uncertain. And I knew that eventually someone would follow the silence. Holmes sat beside her. "Then perhaps you can tell me who created this choir book." She looked down at her hands. "I did, years ago, at the request of a man I no longer name. He wanted the appearance of music to match the donations being reported. But no songs were ever written. No voices were raised. It was all for the record." "Ruth found your name in the old letters," Holmes said gently. "She saw that you had left the church, but she didn't know you had returned." The woman nodded. "I returned not to serve, but to keep watch, to make sure no one else was swallowed by that silence. But I failed. Ruth died, and I said nothing." Holmes looked at her for a long moment. "Then say something now." She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, there were tears there but also strength. "The bell here hasn't rung in 5 years," she said. "The rope was cut after someone tried to summon help one night, and no one came. I know who cut it, and I know who ordered it, but I have no proof, only memory, only shame." Holmes placed a hand lightly on the closed choir book. "That may be enough." We left the church as the sun slipped lower behind the trees. Holmes carried the blank choir book with him, wrapped in a cloth. He said little on the journey home, but his eyes remained focused fixed not on the present, but on something coming, some chord yet to be struck. And I began to feel, for the first time, that the case we had thought closed was no longer a single chapter, but a beginning, a prelude, and that the silence Ruth March left behind was not an ending, but the opening note of a song that had not yet dared to be sung. Chapter 15. The Names That Never Appeared. We returned to Baker Street that evening with the Choir book sealed inside a brown parcel, its weight far greater than the paper and leather that composed it. Holmes placed it on the desk with uncommon care, as though it might disintegrate under the wrong touch. Then he stood by the window for a long while, looking out into the lamplit fog as it drifted through the narrow street. The gaslight flickered against his profile, and I could see that same expression I had come to recognize over the years, the one he wore when the facts were known. Yet the shape of the truth had not yet taken its final form. I asked nothing, merely waited, and eventually Holmes turned, not with an answer, but with a question. "Watson, do you recall the name Emily Thorne?" I thought a moment. "From the early ledgers. Ruth March referenced her once, I believe, in a note to herself, but no context was given." Holmes nodded. "She was a choral teacher, disappeared quietly from parish records in 1885, vanished, one might say, without comment. But I found her name again twice. Once in the margins of a donation receipt at St. Mary's Cray, and again in a forgotten parish report filed under a separate name, entirely E.T. Langford. I understood then. Esther Langford." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Indeed, Esther and Emily were one and the same. She changed her name when she left the church system, and she has spent the last 2 decades watching from the edges, moving between parishes, following the quiet unraveling of this long deception and the truth." I asked. "Why leave it blank?" Holmes's voice lowered. "Because she wanted to leave a trace without speaking aloud. It was a record of refusal pages that should have held songs, and instead held silence. A statement made in the only language she still trusted." He stepped back to the parcel and opened it, then removed the Choir book and laid it on the desk beside his notebook. "There's something else," he added. "The numbering on the page's set skips. Page 27 is missing. A small thing, easily overlooked, but a message nonetheless." Holmes retrieved a second record book from his drawer, one we had acquired during the investigation at St. Michael's, containing the names of choir members across several years. He opened it to the final section. The ink faded and the corners curled. "Look here," he said. "In the final column there's no entry for 1885. The choir list halts mid-year, then resumes under a different hand entirely, with different names. The only line written beside the blank is a smudged note, see Ledger E, a ledger that to my knowledge has never been recovered." He tapped the table gently. "The pattern, Watson, is not just in the people. It's in the omissions. The records were edited. Page 27 was not forgotten, it was deliberately removed, just as Emily Thorne was removed, just as Ruth nearly was." We sat late into the night, cross-referencing names, initials, fragments of song titles, and old choir schedules, until Holmes stopped abruptly, his finger resting on a marginal note written in Ruth's own hand. It read, "They are still singing, but not here. Not where we can hear them. Ask the Balask, the bell that was never rung." Holmes looked up. "There is one more church, Watson." not in the city, but on the edge. A parish with a tower whose bell was cast but never installed. The records speak of it only once. Cinnabuilder's report from 1884. The bell was paid for, shipped, but never raised. And no choir was ever formed there, despite 3 years of funding. The church is now sealed and has been since 1890, but the name of its steward at the time was Bancroft. I felt a chill. You think the silence began there? I think it was born there, Holmes said, and like a stain it spread from one church to the next. Choirs silenced, donations misused, truth turned to smoke, and those who tried to name it like Ruth found themselves alone. The next morning we sent word to the diocese requesting access to the forgotten church. While we awaited response, Holmes penned a letter to Esther Langford. He included the missing page numbers from the Choir book and a list of names we had gathered. At the bottom, he wrote one line: "What was removed can still be sung." That night, Holmes stood by the fire once more, the blank Choir book open on his lap. The lamplight flickered softly across the pages, casting shadows in the crease between them. He did not speak as he turned each one, slowly, respectfully, until he reached the end. Then he closed the book and looked up at me, his voice almost a whisper. "Do you hear it, Watson?" "Hear what?" "The space where the song should be." I said nothing, but in the stillness of that moment I understood. The case had grown beyond crime or motive. It had become something larger, quiet reckoning for those whose names had been erased, whose voices had been silenced not by death, but by careful omission. And in that silence, Holmes had begun to listen more carefully than ever before. Chapter 16. The Tower that waited 2 days passed before we received word from the diocesan office. The letter was brief, signed by an undersecretary whose name Holmes recognized from an earlier case, and gave permission for us to visit the grounds of St. Hilda's and the Hilla. Closed officially in 1894, structural reasons, though no such damage had ever been catalogued. The bell, according to the letter, had never been installed due to logistical oversight, and the building had since been sealed for reasons the official deemed inconclusive but sufficient. Holmes read the letter 3 times, then folded it and placed it into his coat. "That is as much an invitation as we'll ever receive," he said. "Pack your coat, Watson. We leave within the hour." The train took us southeast through the outskirts of London, the countryside flattening beneath a pale sky streaked with winter light. As we neared the edge of the city's reach, the trees grew more twisted, the fields more overgrown, and the settlements sparser. St. Hilda's stood alone on a low rise above, a neglected village whose few homes leaned inward like conspirators. No signpost pointed to the church, and we found the path only by tracing a line of broken stones where a wall had once run. It was late afternoon by the time we stood before the gate. The church was a narrow structure of flint and chalk, with a single square tower that rose uncomfortably close to the edge of the hill. No bell hung within it tonely, a rusted wheel suspended from the rafters. Moss coated the lower stones, and vines curled upward toward the shuttered windows. There was no sound but the wind moving faintly through the weeds. Holmes stepped forward first, pushing open the rotted gate with a groan that echoed far too loudly. Inside, the air was sharp with mildew and cold stone. The nave was intact, though stripped of pews. Only the pulpit remained, draped in a white cloth stained with time. The chancel arch had begun to sag, but the walls were dry. Holmes moved quickly, scanning the base of the tower where the bell should have been raised. He paused near a stone platform where broken timbers still lay in place. "They prepared for it," he said softly. "Built the cradle, reinforced the roof, but never brought it up. There's no pulley damage, no tool marks. No attempt was ever made." We ascended the tower steps slowly, the spiral growing narrow and uneven. Dust clung to each crevice, and flakes of mortar had fallen across the stone treads like ash. At the top we reached, beginning to gray the window pane. Before him lay the full archive, the tin box from St. Hilda's, the missing page from the Choir book, Esther Langford's notes, and the list of names we had copied, inked neatly across a long sheet of parchment. Holmes had placed them all in order, not chronologically, but thematically. Names that had disappeared, songs never sung, churches closed under silence, crimes not of blood, but of concealment. He did not look up. "Watson," he said softly, "what we solved was never a case. It was a chorus that never found breath." I nodded slowly, understanding. The chain of events that had begun with a lipstick mark in a Bible had led us through false ledgers, missing music, and forgotten lives. And though we had uncovered the facts, it was not the facts Holmes held now, but the shape of something greater, a design left unfinished. That evening we attended a carol service at St. Michael's the church where Ruth March had once kept her vigil over the linens and the keys. It had reopened in full since Bancroft's arrest. The organ had been tuned, the candles restored. A small but determined choir had formed. Miss Vellum was not present, but her name had returned to the hymn lists. Holmes and I sat near the back, unnoticed by most. The music swelled gently, the choir imperfect but brave, their voices cracking at times with emotion more than fatigue. And then, unexpectedly, the final carol was announced, one I recognized from the program. The vicar raised his hand, and a hush fell. The choir began a slow, unfamiliar melody. It was the song Requiem for the Forgotten. It had found its way into the world as the first notes filled the church. I saw Holmes lower his head slightly, his fingers pressed to his temple as though absorbing something sacred. The choir moved through the piece with trembling reverence, and when they reached the final measure, there was no applause, only stillness. After the service, the vicar approached Holmes and thanked him quietly, as if afraid to speak too loudly in the presence of something delicate. "The music arrived in the post," he said. "No return name, just a page." I recognized Ruth's handwriting at the bottom. Holmes said only, "She is remembered." We left St. Michael's in silence, the bell above the nave ringing out into the dark for the first time in months. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It echoed just enough to reach those who had once stood in fear within those walls, and those who never would again. Back at Baker Street, Holmes placed the final parchment into his archive. He did not label it as a case, nor assign it a number. He simply tucked it between the pages of his violin composition notebook and closed the drawer. "That will be all," he said. And though we would go on to solve many more cases, some with violence, some with brilliance, many with swift conclusions, I would often think back on this one as the only case Holmes never truly wanted to end, for it had no villain to outwit, no puzzle to unpick, only voices asking to be heard, and Holmes, who listened better than anyone I have ever known, gave them what they had always been denied, a place to be, a name to keep. Holmes did not speak much in the days that followed. He took no new clients that week, though several came calling. He spent his time with the violin or walking the longer paths through Regent's Park, often returning with gloves dusted from stonework or sleeves marked with chalk from gravestones. I asked once if he was searching for something more, another name, perhaps another page. He merely shook his head. "No, Watson. I am not seeking, only listening. Some echoes take time to fade." One evening, I returned home to find him seated at the fire. The photograph of Ruth March beside him, next to Esther's unsigned letter. He had copied the names from the belfry into a private notebook, every initial, every carving and written beneath them. In his precise hand, "This is where their song resumed." He glanced at me then, not with his usual wryness, but with something rare, a quiet sort of peace. "It was not a case, after all," he said. "It was a chorus. And for once, Watson, we were not meant to lead, only to listen, only to carry the tune until others remembered the words. And so we did. A tune that could not end. A wooden hatch that opened into the belfry. Holmes eased it up, and we emerged into a space wide enough for two men, with slats of pale light filtering through the louvers. The iron wheel above us hung limp and useless, a relic of a plan that never came to life. But it was the floor that held Holmes's attention. There, carved roughly into the wood, were initials, dozens of them, some faint, others bold, no dates, no surnames, just single letters and marks: METS, VLMAW, etched in overlapping disorder. Holmes crouched, fingers brushing each groove. "This," he murmured, "was the place they came when they had no other. Those who knew, those who saw, those who were told to remain silent. This was the choir." I knelt beside him. "But why mark the floor?" "Because names matter," Holmes said. "Even when the voice is taken, the name can remain. It's the simplest defiance, the quietest resistance." He stood slowly, brushing the dust from his knees. There was no congregation here, no sermons. This church existed only as a shell facade, to funnel funds, to pad ledgers, to appear whole. But someone, perhaps Emily, perhaps others, made this tower into something else, a ledger of the forgotten. He moved to the far corner, where a loose board had warped outward. Beneath it, tucked into the hollow space, was a small tin box. Holmes retrieved it and opened the lid. Inside were folded slips of paper, faded, fragile. Each bore a name. No message, just a name. Some we recognized: Ruth March, Esther Langford, even Sarah Vellum. But most were unfamiliar. Dozens more. The full count of those who had tried to speak and been silenced in return. Holmes placed the box in his coat with great care, then stepped back into the center of the tower. "The bell was never hung," he said, "but this place rang all the same, not with sound, but with presence. These names are the tolling." We descended as the light began to fail. The church below had darkened, and the wind pressed harder against the stone. As we crossed the nave once more, Holmes paused at the pulpit. He ran his hand along its edge, then turned to me. Ruth died in silence, Watson, but what she saw led us here. This church was the origin, the wound, and we are no longer looking at a single thread. We are holding the whole tapestry now. I nodded slowly. What will we do with it? Holmes turned toward the door. We will gather the names. We will place them in the record, and we will speak them. That, more than any arrest or confession, will end this. He paused. Justice begins where silence ends. As we left St. Hilda's behind us, the wind carried a low, hollow sound across the hill. Not a bell, not quite, but something close to it. A groan of wood, a hush of air, a memory of a note that had waited too long to be struck. And though the bell tower stood empty, we knew that its time was coming. Chapter 17. The paper hidden in the wall. We returned to Baker Street just before dusk. Our coats heavy with dust and the cold of St. Hilda's still clinging to our bones. Holmes spoke little on the journey, and I did not interrupt his silence. There was a gravity to him now, the tension of a mind locked in calculation, but the quiet burden of having uncovered something long buried and knowing it would not rest again. Once home, he placed the tin box from the tower gently on the mantelpiece. Neither of us opened it that evening. It was enough, for now, to have brought it into the light. The next morning, we began the slow task of cataloging each name. Holmes laid out sheets of parchment, one for each church we had visited, and began assigning initials from the floorboards to locations. Some matched known records, others remained mysteries. I read names aloud as Holmes made notes, and the room slowly filled with an invisible choir, dozens of forgotten lives gathering unbidden across our desk. It was the most solemn work I had ever seen Holmes perform. Midway through the task, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson opened it to reveal a young woman, perhaps 20 years of age, with wind-reddened cheeks and eyes far older than her years. She clutched a folded piece of paper and asked softly for Mr. Holmes. He greeted her gently, ushered her inside, and asked how she had found us. She explained that her mother, who had once sung under Miss Thorne at a parish in South London, had received a letter just days earlier. It had no return address, only a single line. If your daughter still remembers the hymn, she must bring it. Holmes studied her for a moment, then motioned toward the note she held. She unfolded it. Inside was not a letter, but a sheet of music. Simple, only 8 measures long. A fragment of melody without lyrics. Holmes stared at it for some time. Then he said, almost to himself, the unsung song. He asked her to play it, if she could. She nodded, then sat at the pianoforte in the corner. Her fingers were hesitant, but steady, and when the notes emerged soft, slow, they carried something neither of us had expected. Grief, recognition. It was a melody meant to be heard in silence. When she finished, Holmes rose and crossed to the fireplace. From the tin box, he withdrew one of the slips of paper and held it beside the music. On the slip was enamel mortenand, a date, July 1885. The girl who vanished from St. Luke's. Holmes murmured. Her departure was never explained. But this music, this was likely hers. It was meant to be part of the Choi book. He turned to the young woman. Do you know it? She shook her head. No. But my mother said it was the last piece Miss Thorne ever composed before she was dismissed. Dismissed. A quiet word for a quiet crime. After she left, Holmes sat with the music in his lap, reading it like scripture. Then he stood. "There's one more place we must go," he said. "Not a church this time. A house." I looked at him. "Whose?" "The house where Miss Thorne lived after she left the church. Esther Langford." He met my gaze. "I believe she kept something from us. Not out of deceit, but out of hope. Hope that we would find it on our own." We traveled by cab that afternoon, heading south to a quiet crescent lined with old brick homes and ivy-covered fences. Holmes led us to number 17, a modest house with lace curtains and a small brass plate that simply read Langford. No one answered our knock, but the neighbor, an older gentleman in a brown cardigan, recognized Holmes and offered us the key. "She left last week," he said. "Didn't say where. Left a note saying she was going north to listen. Didn't make much sense. But she asked that if anyone came asking for the truth, we should let them in." We entered quietly. The house was neat, the furniture covered in linen cloths, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Holmes moved slowly, respectfully. In the study, he found rows of hymnals, journals, and music folios. On the mantel, above a faded photograph of two women standing outside a chapel, sat a ceramic angel with broken wings. Holmes touched nothing for a long while. Then he moved to the far wall where a framed embroidery hung slightly crooked. He removed it, revealing a narrow hollow behind the plaster. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a bundle of old documents, ledger pages, letters, and beneath them all, a single sheet folded into quarters. Holmes opened it carefully. It was the missing page, page 27 of the Choyer book. Unlike the others, it held music, not blank, not unfinished. Music with a title, Requiem for the Forgotten. The notes were delicate, sorrowful, and beneath them, in small, even writing, were 5 names: Ruth March, Emily Thorne, Sarah Vellum, L. Morton, and one we had not seen before, Thomas Bancroft. Holmes stared at it for a long time. "She wrote them into the music," he said. "It wasn't just memory, it was resurrection. She gave them a place no silence could erase." We left the house just as dusk fell, the page carefully stored among Holmes's notes. That evening we said nothing, not because there was nothing to say, but as the lamps dimmed and the fire settled into embers, Holmes played the melody once more on the violin soft, as though not to wake the ghosts. And in that tune there were no answers, only presence, and presence, at last, was enough. Chapter 18. Holmes and the Tune That Could Not End It was a week before Christmas, when Holmes finally rose before dawn. I awoke to the sound of quiet movement in the sitting room, the faint creak of floorboards. By the time I joined him, he had lit the fire and was seated at his desk. The morning light, just